What's up? Today I've got the 5 best opening traps for you. They work extremely well for blitz and bullet, but of course in classical games you may still use them. Another little note that I've picked games of really strong players, rated 2400 all the way up to 3000. So if these traps work against so strong players, then of course they're gonna work against weaker opponents like crazy. And the first one we're gonna see in a very popular opening, the 2 Knights game. The black player, for reference, is 2900 rated. After bishop c4, knight f6, white goes knight g5. So the classical attempt of white to attack this f7 square, black usually covers it with pawn d5, and after an exchange there is an old and still used by many players trap where black naturally recaptures here on d5. It's a known trap because white here has the opportunity to play knight takes f7, starting the so-called fried liver attack. And even though it is an option, the following position is actually still complicated and tricky. It's not like completely winning, so it's a good move for white, but it's complicated. And there is another way, which is much less known, and it's equally effective. It's the move pawn d4. And in fact, in this position, even Stockfish is like having doubts of which move is better, either knight f7 or pawn d4, because both of them are very strong. But pawn d4 is a lot easier and a lot simpler for you to play. That's why I suggest this. In majority of the games, your opponents will capture this pawn, and after pawn c3, all of a sudden they'll figure out that they're losing the knight here, because this knight is being attacked, and if the knight goes back, they're gonna lose the other knight on d5. And in fact, in most games, they just play knight e6, and then you simply grab the knight happily, you want a piece, and the game. And I love this variation for simplicity. If I'm not mistaken, it's called the Lolli attack. I think it's called that way. Now let's revert a couple moves back and see if black captures here with a pawn. That is also pretty good for you because now it opens up the e-file that you can also use to attack black. And now you can simply castle, preparing potentially to get your rook involved and to attack the king, in addition to all other pieces of yours putting strong pressure against the black's king. So black is here losing like really badly. For example, after bishop e7, you can now sacrifice an f7, but now it's a lot more effective, because after queen f3 check, I have all these open lines, to attack black, and you've got a devastating attack here. Usually they play, bishop f6 to cover the king, then bishop takes d5 check, you got your knight back, you keep attacking the king, which is completely exposed here, and you got an easy win. And the second trap is my personal favorite. It works against the Sicilian Defense. We already talked about e5, most popular move, and the second most popular move is the Sicilian Defense, pawn c5. Now you can completely shock your opponent by playing a seemingly weird move pawn a3. And it sets such a hidden trap that it is completely impossible for black to figure it out unless they are preparing. Most of your opponents certainly will be unfamiliar with the move pawn a3. Now, what black's going to do here, because you're probably preparing the move pawn b4, so they're going to play knight c6, thinking that, hey, now I'm controlling this square 2 times, so I don't care about your move pawn b4. But you play it anyway. And after black accepts this pawn sacrifice, and they're kind of forced to do that, because if not, the pawn can go forward and attack the knight. So they're going to take it. Now you play pawn c3, attacking the knight, and then pawn d4. And as a result of this little operation, yes, you sacrifice the pawn, but you have 2 beautiful pawns in the center, and you're threatening to push the pawn forward d5 and keep driving the knight away. Black doesn't love this, and they play pawn d5 themselves. Now, after this point, it seems like black is doing really great. They're pawn up, they're seemingly better developed, looks like they're just winning. But it's a false impression, because after knight a3, in the vast majority of the games I played, black is just lost so badly that it's unbelievable. The thing is, you've got a threat of knight b5, and it's surprisingly super strong, because if black goes knight f6, which they do in most of the games, or anything else, your opponents can try anything else, but you're gonna play knight b5 anyway. Now, your major threat is knight c7, which is a really nasty threat. It's going to be a triple fork to the king, queen, and the rook. What more can you ask for? Now, black needs to cover that somehow, and let's say they're going to play queen d7 here to do that. By the way, if they play queen d8 instead, I've got another video where I analyze that, and white is winning here. So let's take a look at queen d7, another popular option. Then you're going to surprise black once again with a cool attacking move, pawn d5. You still attack this knight, somehow this knight can never find a safe square in this game, and it looks that black can take it on d5, that pawn. But in reality they can't, because that fails to another tactics. You temporarily sacrifice your queen here, and on the next move you're gonna play knight c7 and take the queen back, but along the way you won the black's knight from f6. Therefore you're up a piece and it's time for black to resign. Therefore, it turns out that black can't take your pawn, and then they have to move their knight away. So if they play knight e5, let's say, then you play bishop f4, attacking the knight once again, has to move again, and now knight take to c7 check. So the point of having your bishop here is that it supports the knight, and you can land it there anyway, and that's the beginning of the end for black. After the king moves somewhere, you could take the rook, but it's even easier to save your bishop from the attack, so that black can't capture it with their knight. So you retreat to safety, and now you still want to win the rook for nothing. So after the rook moves, you have different winning moves here. The one that I love the most, which is completely brutal, is knight e6 check. Bishop b5 is another winning move, but knight e6 I think is just so juicy here. Check to the king, discover attack to the rook, but even more so, after black accepts the knight sacrifice here, you now attack the queen. Okay. After they take on d1, rook recaptures with check. These diagonals controlled by the bishop, so all of a sudden, even in an endgame, you develop a pretty strong attack of opponent's king. So the king has to move now. Bishop b5, check to the king once again, and black would have to, sacrifice one of their pieces here to prevent from being checkmated. And if they move one of their pieces to d7, you can take that. You can take the rook then, and that's just so winning that black will probably resign right now. Right, now let's take a look at one trap for black side. After the move pawn d4, knight f6, c4, the main moves, here you can play e5, starting the so-called Budapest Gambit, which is probably something your opponents aren't ready to face. And after pawn takes, you play knight g4, and you aim to take the pawn back. Therefore, naturally your opponents will try to defend it somehow. They're going to play knight f3, you respond with a knight to c6, attacking this pawn once more. So they play bishop f4 defending it, and now bishop b4, check to the king. If they play knight c3, you can in the future, take that knight and double their pawns. Therefore, instead they usually cover their king by playing knight to d2. Now you play queen e7, still want to recapture the pawn back, and now what do? They can't defend the pawn anymore, so very often they play pawn a3, trying to neutralize your active bishop. And at this point, I suggest that you very quickly take here on a5, pretending like it was a pre-move and you just played it according to your plan, overlooking the threat to your bishop. Not always, but quite frequently in this position, they're going to capture your bishop here on b4, falling into a really beautiful smother checkmate after knight d3. The pawn is pinned, therefore it is actually a checkmate, and it keeps happening in the game, in real games, over and over again, just because all the previous moves were so natural that led to this position. And the beauty of this trap is that even if white does not overlook this checkmate, you're still getting an equal game, more or less equal position, and you can keep playing on the normal game of chess. The next trap is also quite shocking. I'm not sure if I would notice it if I were black. Here after a4, occasionally your opponents will play a6. Definitely not the mainstream move, but some of your amateur opponents will play this, aiming for b5 and then bishop b7. It makes sense, it was played even by grandmasters. Now here, instead of playing d4 or knight f3, something like that, you may play bishop c4, which looks like a normal development move, and black may be happy to see this move because now their move b5 actually seemed to win a tempo, and that's what they intended to play. That's the purpose of the move a6, to prepare this move pawn b5. Therefore, majority of your opponents place here pawn b5, have tracked it in the database, but funnily enough, this move loses because now you have winning tactics. And you may think about this for a second yourself, in case you can find it yourself. It's bishop takes f7. Very often, bishop takes f7 is the beginning of a deadly attack, or at least it leads to some side advantages for you. And in this case, after king takes, queen h5, check to the king, it turns out that you're gonna win the exchange. So after the king is being protected, you play queen d5 with the double attack to the king and rook. So as a result of these little tactics, you're winning a pawn and an exchange, and the black's king is exposed. Therefore, all in all, you're getting a winning position. Okay, the next trap is for black once again after d4, knight f6. A relatively popular opening here for white is bishop g5. The Trompowsky opening was played even by Carlsen. And here, you may play a tricky move pawn c6. Generally speaking, this pawn c6 idea is very common for black against any kind of early development of this bishop here or in different kind of London system stuff. The idea is that black often can bring their queen out to b6 and take advantage of the fact that the pawn on b2 is not defended by the white's dark square bishop anymore. So that's what your opponents are probably familiar with. And they may play pawn e3, which is part of their usual setup here. Pawn e3, knight f3, maybe pawn c3 in the future or something like that. But now, all of a sudden, instead of queen b6, you move your queen one square further, and all of a sudden you win the game immediately. It's a very, sudden thing for white, so a lot of opponents overlook this. It's a double attack to the king and bishop, and you just win the bishop for nothing. And again, the beauty of this trap is that if white does not overlook this, if they play something else instead of pawn e3, you just get a very good game anyway. So in most of the games, it's just check that they usually capture here, but then you recapture by the pawn, you play pawn d5, you have two bishops, and it's good. The move pawn c6 is useful anyway, helps you to build up your pawn chain in the middle of the board, so you have no risk here, and you can set a trap along the way. And here is a puzzle of the day. It is white to move, and if you can find a way for white to win this game, then please write it down in the comments below this video. You may check out the video I mentioned earlier by clicking the link over there where I'm showing you how to crush the Sicilian defense as white in great details. Also, if you're enjoying this, you may consider subscribing to the channel so that you don't miss out on our next uploads, and you may also hit the bell so that you'll get notified immediately. Thank you very much, take care, talk to you soon.